The Italian DNA Enigma. Who were the Romans? Really? In 2019, a team of researchers published the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted on the Italian peninsula. They analysed genetic material from over 100 individuals spanning 9,000 years of history, from the Stone Age all the way through the fall of the Roman Empire. What they found contradicted almost everything that Italians had been taught about their own origins. The story that most people carry about Italian identity goes something like this. The Romans built the greatest empire the ancient world ever saw. Italians today are the descendants of those Romans, the blood of Caesar, of Augustus, of the legions that marched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. It flows, more or less intact, through the people drinking espresso in Milan and Naples today. It is a powerful story. It is also, genetically speaking, far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. Here is the question that DNA science has spent the last decade trying to answer. If you could extract genetic material from a Roman senator buried near the Forum and compare it to a modern Italian standing in that same location today, how similar would they actually be? The answer is stranger than you think, because what the genetics reveal is that the Italian peninsula was never a single unified genetic pool. It was always a crossroads, a place where waves of migration, conquest, trade and settlement layered on top of each other across thousands of years, each one leaving a permanent mark in the DNA of the people who came after. The Romans did not have pure blood. Nobody did. Nobody ever has. And the people who live in Italy today carry genetic signatures from populations that ancient Romans would not even have recognized as their own. Consider this. The genetic profile of the average person buried in the city of Rome during the height of the empire was more similar to a modern Lebanese or Syrian person than to a modern Norwegian. That is not a theory. That is what the ancient DNA samples actually show. The story of Italian genetics is the story of a peninsula that sat at the junction of three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and absorbed a piece of everyone who ever passed through it. This is the story of what DNA found underneath the myth. And the deeper you dig into that history, literally with trowels and sample tubes in ancient burial grounds, the more it becomes clear that Italy was never a country with one genetic story. It was always a living, breathing archive of the ancient world's most consequential migrations. The science that made this possible, ancient DNA from 2,000-year-old teeth, did not exist a generation ago. It exists now. Before Rome, there were the Etruscans. From roughly 900 to 400 BC, the Etruscan civilization dominated the western portion of the Italian peninsula, the region we now call Tuscany, whose very name derives from theirs. They built sophisticated cities with planned street grids and stone drainage systems. They mined and traded copper, iron and tin across the Mediterranean. They developed complex religious rituals, elaborate funeral ceremonies, and a vibrant artistic tradition that would directly influence the culture of early Rome. And they spoke a language that nobody, not the Greeks, not the Romans, not any neighbouring culture, could understand. Etruscan was completely unrelated to Latin, to Greek, or to any other known Indo-European language. Even today, after centuries of scholarly effort, Etruscan remains only partially deciphered. We can read the letters. We often cannot understand the words. The Etruscans left behind extraordinary burials. Wealthy individuals were interred in carved stone chambers beneath artificial hills called tumuli, filled with painted frescoes, bronze vessels, gold jewellery, and personal objects meant to accompany them into the afterlife. Some tomb paintings depicted feasting scenes, musicians, wrestlers, and dancers, images of a society that celebrated pleasure and life, even in the architecture of death. Archaeologists excavating these sites across Tuscany and Lazio have recovered skeletal remains in exceptional condition, including intact teeth, which are, as ancient DNA researchers know, the best possible source for extracting preserved genetic material from ancient individuals. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus had a theory about Zal, where the Etruscans came from. He wrote that they migrated from Lydia, the region of western Turkey, driven west across the Aegean by a great famine. For centuries, this was the dominant academic explanation for their mysterious language and distinctly non-Roman culture. In 2023, a major ancient DNA study published in the journal Science Advances finally subjected that theory to direct genetic testing. The results overturned nearly everything that Herodotus had written and opened a new set of questions that nobody had anticipated. The Etruscans were also remarkable engineers. The 2023 ancient DNA study of Etruscan remains was led by researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, working with teams from multiple European universities. They sequenced genetic material from Etruscan individuals recovered from burial sites across Tuscany and Lazio, spanning roughly 800 BC to 200 BC. The headline finding: the Etruscans were not from Anatolia. They did not migrate from Turkey, as Herodotus had claimed for 2,500 years. Their DNA placed them firmly within the Western European genetic landscape, closely related to the Bronze Age populations that had been living on the Italian peninsula for centuries before Etruscan civilization emerged. This was a genuine surprise. If their DNA was local, if they were genetically continuous with other Bronze Age Italians, then why did they speak a completely unique and unrelated language? Why were their burial practices so different from their neighbours? Why did Greek and Roman writers consistently treat them as something foreign and strange? The current best scientific explanation is that the Etruscan language was not imported by migrants arriving from outside Europe. Instead, it was a surviving remnant. An extremely ancient linguistic tradition that predated the spread of Indo-European languages across Italy, preserved through cultural isolation in a way that surrounding populations' languages were not. They were not outsiders who arrived and stayed different. They were insiders who had always been different and who held on to that difference long after everyone around them had changed. But the part of this story that connects directly to modern Italy is what happened after Rome absorbed the Etruscan cities. The Romans did not exterminate the Etruscans. They assimilated them, politically, culturally, and genetically. Within a few generations of Roman conquest, the Etruscans stopped being Etruscans in any formal sense. Their language disappeared. Their religious institutions were absorbed into Roman practice. And their genes, that ancient, distinctly Western European lineage, became one of the foundational layers of what we now call Italian DNA. The people the Romans defeated became the Romans, and their genetic contribution survives in Italy to this day. The Etruscan case also raises a broader point about the relationship between genetics and culture. DNA can tell you where a population came from biologically. It cannot tell you why they chose the customs they chose, what language they spoke, or what they believed about death and the gods. Here is something that rarely appears in standard history textbooks about Rome. The genetic makeup of the Italian population shifted significantly not once, but multiple times before the Roman Empire even reached its peak power. The most dramatic pre-imperial shift occurred during the Iron Age, roughly 1000 to 500 BC, when ancient DNA studies detect a substantial influx of new genetic ancestry arriving from two directions almost simultaneously. From the east came ancestry connected to populations in the ancient Near East and the Caucasus region, the same broad movement that brought Iron Age metalworking technology, new agricultural practices, and new religious ideas across much of the Mediterranean world. From the north and west came genetic signals associated with steppe-related ancestry, the descendants of populations who had expanded from the Eurasian grasslands into Central and Western Europe during the Bronze Age, and who continued pressing southward into the Italian peninsula through the early Iron Age. The Italian peninsula during this period was not a quiet backwater waiting for Rome to arrive. It was one of the most commercially active zones in the entire Mediterranean world. Phoenician merchants from what is now Lebanon established trading stations along the western Italian coasts. Greek colonists were settling southern Italy and Sicily so thoroughly that the Romans would later call the entire region Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Celtic peoples were moving southward from Central Europe, eventually sacking Rome itself in 390 BC. Every one of these population movements left a traceable genetic signature. The result, by the time Rome consolidated power over the peninsula in the 3rd century BC, was a population that was already genetically layered and deeply complex. The idea of a pure Latin origin, the founding mythology that Roman writers loved to construct, tracing Roman descent back to Aeneas of Troy or to the divine twins Romulus and Remus, was already a historical fiction by the time those stories were being written down. Rome was born a melting pot. It was about to become a considerably larger one. The ancient DNA record also captures something that written history rarely acknowledges: the sheer ordinariness of migration in the ancient world. The people who moved were not always warriors or conquerors. They were also merchants following trade routes, farmers seeking better land, crafts, people carrying specialized skills. At the height of the Roman Empire, roughly the 1st through 3rd centuries AD, the city of Rome itself had a population of somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. It was, by a very considerable margin, the largest city on Earth at that time. No city in the world would approach its population again for more than 1,000 years. Where did all those people come from? The ancient DNA study of Imperial-era Rome, published in the journal Science in 2019, provided a striking and counterintuitive answer. The genetic profiles of individuals buried in Rome during the imperial period, across multiple cemeteries representing different social classes, looked far more like modern populations from the Eastern Mediterranean than like Northern or Western Europeans. The reason is straightforward. The Roman Empire's economic engine ran entirely on the movement of people. Enslaved individuals were brought to Rome from Greece, from Anatolia, from Syria, from Egypt, and from North Africa in massive numbers. Freed slaves who gained Roman citizenship married into the local population and raised families. Merchants, scholars, physicians, artists, soldiers, and administrators followed the trade routes into the capital from every corner of the empire. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century AD, complained bitterly that the Orontes, the major river of Syria, had drained into the Tiber. He meant it as a cultural complaint about Eastern immigrants changing the character of his city. He was also, genetically speaking, accurately describing exactly what the DNA record now confirms was happening. The most vivid individual evidence comes from Pompeii. Buried instantly by volcanic ash in 79 AD, the city preserved its inhabitants' skeletal remains in exceptional condition. Ancient DNA extracted from Pompeii's dead has confirmed the extraordinary genetic diversity of imperial Italy, revealing individuals carrying ancestry from across the Mediterranean world, living as ordinary neighbours in a single provincial city far from the capital. The Roman Empire did not create a unified Italian genetic identity. It created a Mediterranean genetic identity. Spread it across the known world. The DNA also documents something that ancient social historians have long argued from literary sources, that social mobility in the Roman Empire was real and significant. Freed slaves became citizens. Citizens' children became merchants, officers, and administrators. The genetic mixing documented in the ancient DNA record was not just a feature of the lower classes. In 476 AD, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic military commander Odoacer. The event historians mark as the fall of Rome was, in practical terms, the culmination of a process that had been underway for at least a century. Germanic commanders had been effectively controlling the Western Empire's military for decades before anyone made the political change official. But the genetic consequences of what followed were real, lasting, and measurable today. Over the 2 centuries that followed, successive waves of Germanic peoples relocated permanently into the Italian peninsula. The Visigoths moved through first. The Vandals raided from North Africa. Most consequentially, the Lombards arrived in 568 AD and established a kingdom that held northern and central Italy for over 200 years, long enough to permanently reshape the region's culture, law, and genetics. Their name survives in the name of Italy's most populous region, Lombardy. These were not raiding parties that came and left. They were full population relocations, men, women, children, livestock and everything portable, permanently resettling in a territory that had previously been Roman. A major 2017 study published in Nature Communications sequenced ancient DNA from Lombard burial sites in northern Italy. The results confirmed that these individuals carried genetic profiles consistent with Scandinavian and Central European ancestry, clearly distinct from the Roman-era Italian population found in the same geographic area. The archaeology of Lombard burials looks nothing like Roman funerary practice. Warriors were interred alongside their horses, a tradition completely foreign to Roman custom but well documented across the Germanic and Central Asian steppe world. Some were buried with complete weapon sets and personal ornaments in a style that connects directly to Northern European and even Central Asian burial traditions. This is the genetic explanation for something that has generated cultural tension in Italy for centuries. Why Northern Italians, on average, carry measurably higher frequencies of Northern European ancestry than Southern Italians. The Alps slowed the Germanic migrations but did not stop them, and the demographic difference they created has never fully disappeared. The Lombard period also left a lasting imprint on Italian law and administration that persisted long after the Lombards themselves had been absorbed into the broader Italian population. Southern Italy and Sicily carry a different history from the north, and their DNA tells a completely different story, one that is, in its own way, even more layered. The ancient Greeks called southern Italy Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, because by the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Greek colonists had established cities along the southern coastlines so numerous and prosperous that the region was more Greek in culture than it was anything else. Sybaris, Croton, Tarentum, and Syracuse were not small outposts. They were major urban centres where Greek philosophy, architecture, mathematics, and early democratic governance flourished. Centuries before Rome became the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. The genetic impact of this Greek colonial presence was significant and lasting. Southern Italian and Sicilian populations today carry measurable ancestry from the Aegean world that traces directly to this colonial period, 2,500 years in the past. But Sicily's genetic story did not stop with the Greeks. In the 9th and 10th centuries AD, Arab armies from North Africa conquered the island and governed it for roughly 200 years. During that period, Sicily became one of the most intellectually sophisticated, multicultural societies in the medieval world, a place where Arabic, Greek and Latin coexisted as living languages, where Islamic, Byzantine Christian and Latin Christian traditions intersected daily, and where Arab scholars preserved classical Greek science and philosophy at a moment when much of that knowledge had been lost in the rest of Europe. The Arab presence left a traceable genetic signature, a North African component measurably present in modern Sicilian DNA that distinguishes the island population from mainland Italy. Then the Normans arrived. the same Viking descendants who conquered England in 1066 simultaneously established a kingdom in southern Italy and Sicily, adding yet another genetic layer, Norse ancestry, to an already extraordinarily complex population. Modern genetic studies consistently identify Sicilians as among the most admixed populations in Europe. The genetic complexity of southern Italy has one more layer worth noting. During the Byzantine period, roughly 535 to 1071 AD, much of southern Italy was governed directly from Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Greek was the administrative language. Greek Orthodox Christianity was the dominant faith. In the middle of the same Mediterranean that was constantly being crossed, traded through, invaded, and resettled by every major civilization of the ancient world, one population managed to remain almost entirely apart from all of it. The Sardinians. Sardinia is the second largest island in the Mediterranean, sitting far enough offshore that the great, successive waves of migration and conquest that transformed the genetics of mainland Europe largely passed it by. The result, preserved in the DNA of people living on the island today, is something that geneticists describe as genuinely extraordinary. The genetic profile of the first farmers of Europe, preserved nearly intact across 9,000 years of continuous habitation. When Neolithic farmers moved out of Anatolia and spread into Europe, beginning around 9,000 years ago, they carried a distinctive genetic signature, the profile of early agricultural communities that had developed in the ancient Near East. Across most of Europe, that ancient signature was subsequently diluted through layer upon layer of genetic mixing, with hunter-gatherers already living in Europe, then with Bronze Age steppe migrants, then with the Iron Age and historical era population, movements described in earlier episodes. In Sardinia, that process barely happened. The island's geographic isolation, combined with cultural patterns limiting intermarriage with outsiders across many generations, meant that the ancient Neolithic farmer ancestry was preserved with a fidelity found nowhere else in Europe. This is why population geneticists routinely use Sardinian DNA as a reference point when modelling ancient European populations. Sardinian genetic profiles closely approximate what the earliest farming communities of prehistoric Europe actually looked like. They are, in a precise and technical sense, a living archive of a genetic world that has been overwritten everywhere else. This same ancient ancestry is also connected to the extraordinary longevity documented in parts of Sardinia. The island has one of the highest concentrations of centenarians on Earth, one of 5 global blue zones, where people routinely live past 100. Whether the genetics directly contribute to this longevity, or whether diet, community structure, and lifestyle are the primary factors, remains an active area of scientific research. What is certain is that Sardinia represents a human genetic record that is, quite simply, irreplaceable. The Nuragic civilization that built Sardinia's thousands of stone towers, structures that still dominate in the past decade, consumer DNA testing has placed the tools of ancient population genetics directly into the hands of ordinary people. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry, DNA, have processed tens of millions of samples worldwide. And for many Italians, the results have been genuinely disorienting in ways that go beyond simple surprise. The typical experience follows a recognizable pattern. A person who has grown up with a strong sense of regional Italian identity, Tuscan, Sicilian, Venetian, Neapolitan, orders a test expecting confirmation of what the family story has always said. They expect to see something that matches Italian, Mediterranean, perhaps broadly Roman. Instead, the breakdown comes back showing Greek ancestry, Levantine ancestry, North African ancestry, German or Scandinavian ancestry, and a scatter of smaller components that map onto no simple narrative. "I thought I was 100% Italian" is a phrase that appears in various forms across countless online discussions of these results. The follow-up question is almost always the same. But what does that even mean? It turns out to have no clean answer, because Italian is not a genetic category. It is a geographic and political label applied to a peninsula that has functioned as a crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa for at least 9,000 years of continuous human occupation and movement. The 2019 science study made this point with particular clarity. The researchers found that the genetic diversity within Italy, between north and south, between island and mainland populations, is comparable in scale to the genetic diversity found across much of the rest of Europe taken as a whole. Italy is not one genetic story. It is many stories layered on top of each other in the same landscape. There is also a socially important dimension to this finding: the persistent cultural and political tension between northern and southern Italy, a divide that has generated genuine political instability for over a century, has sometimes been framed in terms of ethnic or even racial difference. Ancient DNA provides a precise and definitive correction. Both the north and the south of Italy are genetically complex, historically layered, and built from overlapping sources. The differences between them are real. Their cause is history, not biology. And once you understand the history, the differences make complete and unsurprising sense. There is also a personal dimension to the DNA test experience that statistics alone cannot capture. Let's bring everything together. 9,000 years of genetic history on the Italian peninsula, compressed into a single picture. It begins with the first farmers who walked out of Anatolia 9,000 years ago, carrying early agricultural knowledge into a continent still populated by small bands of hunter-gatherers. Their descendants became the dominant population of prehistoric Italy, and their genetic signature survives today with near-perfect clarity in the isolated island population of Sardinia, a living record of a world that has been overwritten everywhere else on the continent. The Bronze Age brought migrations from the Eurasian steppe, people who introduced the Indo-European languages that would eventually develop into Latin, Greek, and the broader family of modern European languages. The Etruscans emerged from this ancient Italian substrate as a distinct civilization, genetically local, but linguistically and culturally unlike anything around them. When Rome absorbed them, their genes became one of the core foundations of what we now call Italian ancestry. The Roman Republic then absorbed neighbouring peoples, Samnites, Umbrians, Gauls, Greeks, and converted them into Romans through law and culture rather than extermination. The Roman Empire pulled genetic material from across 3 continents simultaneously, transforming the population of the capital city itself into something that resembled the Eastern Mediterranean far more than it resembled Northern Europe. Enslaved people from Greece, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa were brought to Italy, freed, married into the local population, and raised children who became uomowasum. Huimon. 6. Sets. Citizens. When the empire collapsed, Germanic peoples, Lombards foremost among them, moved south and added Northern European ancestry that reshaped the genetics of northern Italy in ways that remain statistically significant and measurable today. In the south, Greek colonization, 2 centuries of Arab governance, and Norman conquest created a different and equally complex genetic mosaic, one that made Sicily specifically one of the most admixed populations in the entire continent. The 2019 Ancient DNA paper stated its conclusion plainly. The genetic history of Rome reflects the history of the Mediterranean world. It is not the story of one people building an empire. It is the story of an empire assembling a people, drawing genetic contributions from every civilization it touched, mixing them in its great urban centres and sending the result back out across the world. When an Italian takes a DNA test today and discovers Greek ancestry, Lebanese ancestry, or German ancestry alongside their Italian components, they are not discovering that they are not really Italian. They are discovering that being Italian was always a richer, stranger, and more historically layered thing than any single origin story could contain. Italy sits at the place where 3 continents almost touch. For 9,000 years, every civilization that moved through that space left something in the people who lived there. The DNA is the complete record of all of them. And that record is not a dilution of identity. It is the fullest possible definition of one.